Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Chairman and CEO of United Technologies Corporation, Greg Hayes, and former President of the plurinational state of Bolivia and Concordia Leadership Council member, His Excellency Jorge Quiroga.
All righty. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Greg. We have the solemn duty to make sure everybody stays awake after lunch and whatever you had there. My name is Jorge Quiroga. I'm from Bolivia, South America. I don't speak English very well, but my Texan is close enough, and it resembles English. It's a pleasure to be in this panel to try to get Greg to address probably one of the largest political challenges anywhere in the developed world. How do we address the need for jobs and job creation and employment generation in times of disruptive technological changes everywhere? I'm old enough to be able to tell you that my daughters do not believe that when I was going to school at a fine engineering institution, Amazon was a river in Brazil. Google was an Argentina radio announcer screaming for a goal for the team. YouTube was something that you saw in movies about the London Underground. Apple was a record label for the Beatles. And of course, my daughters don't even know who the Beatles were. And it was a radically different time. I used to work at IBM. And speaking of workforce, I remember you used to go to work at an office. And there was a terminal that was connected to the computer, and that's what we sold to all the customers. And when you went to work, you had nothing. When you went home, there's nothing you could take from work back home because you were home. And then the IBM PC came in, and some of us at IBM were leading innovators, and we could take some floppy disks and type some documents or do some Lotus 1, 2, 3 at home, and then bring it back to work. But that was way back then. And now suddenly we live in a world that's dramatically different. And in the last 10 years, that's only accelerated because all the tools that you had 10 years ago, they're now right here. And 15 years ago, to have 3 cameras, 2 video recorders, newspapers, your agenda, and everything you have here, you would have to lug a suitcase. And it's a totally different world that we face now. And in the midst of all that, it's clear that in the developing world, we have been doing fairly well. China's industrialization, generations of tens of thousands of jobs, demanding commodities from South America and Africa, have generally made the 21st century a very good start of a century for us. If you sold energy or food or minerals to an industrializing China, we were doing fine. Now, in the developed world, that brings about a lot of issues and difficulties. And we see not only in the US and Europe that you're finding a vital negative center for people in politics that espouse trade protectionism and immigration protectionism. Way back when you would get asked, Greg, if you prefer Republicans or Democrats, I would ask for the blender. Republicans were usually open to our products. Democrats usually open to our people. So I would like, can I get a blender? But now we're getting that blender where people are generally coming together in rejecting migrants and putting in place protectionist trade policies. I think a lot of that has to do because it's easy to blame somebody who doesn't look like you as opposed to blaming the iPhones or technology or the way the world changes. And that's what the world we live in. But I'm just an observer. Greg, you're a practitioner. You run a large company with technology, and what is it like now running a company in the midst of this massive technology disruption? And how do you address the workers that you have? How do you keep them trained, retrained? How do you stay away from replacing everybody with robots in today's 21st century?
Well, first of all, Mr. President, thank you so much for having me today. For those of you that don't know United Technologies, we're a global company. You'll know our brands: Otis Elevator, Carrier Air Conditioning, Pratt & Whitney Jet Engines. We've got about 205,000 people. We operate in about 130 countries around the world. And the biggest challenge, the challenge that every CEO of a major American company has today is people. And that is, how do you get the people you need to do the jobs that are changing so dramatically and so quickly? You know, it's interesting. I recall, and for fear of dating myself, when I first started out of college in 1982, and I joined a company called Arthur Andersen, which no longer exists, there was not a personal computer to be found in the workforce in public accounting. My first personal computer was an IBM 64. It had a disk with DOS, the disk operating system, and a disk with the Lotus Note, or Lotus 123. And I taught myself how to program in Lotus. And I'm thinking, today, everything I do is on my iPad. So you think about the rate of technological change over these last 35 years, what has happened in America from a technology standpoint, what has happened globally. And I would tell you, globally is really the focus here, because globalization, which has perhaps gotten a bad reputation throughout this past campaign season here in America, you have to recall that globalization is the force that lifted 30% of the world's population out of poverty. 1980, there was about 40% of the world lived in poverty. Today, it's about 10%. So globalization, for the most part, has been a tremendous boon to people around the world. Now, of course, people reject globalization because it costs jobs. I would tell you, it's not globalization, right? What we need to find is a way to educate our people. We need to find a way to transform the workforce of today to the workforce of tomorrow. And I think about my own career over 35 years and the different skills that I've had to learn. The things you have coming out of college, you know, while it may be useful momentarily, is not what makes you successful. And I think that's why at United Technologies, we believe in lifelong learning. We have a program called our Employee Scholar Program, and this was founded 20 years ago by our former chairman, George David, with the thought that we cannot guarantee lifetime employment to any employee at UTC. Now, UTC was a much smaller company back then. We were about 20 billion in revenue. Today we're approaching 70 billion. But the fact is, the mantra hasn't changed. We have to re-educate our workforce. And so we have, over the last 20 years, spent about $1.2 billion educating our workforce. 38,000 employees of UTC have earned advanced degrees. We've got about 6,000 people today enrolled in this program, where we pay for all of your tuition, your books, your fees. We give you time off. Wow. And it's not because we're generous. In fact, I think it's a little bit self-serving, because what we want is the best educated workforce in the world. And our products, our jet engines and our elevators and our air conditioners, they're successful because we continue to innovate. And innovation doesn't come from companies, it comes from people, and it comes from well-educated people. And that's why we're so focused on this topic.
It's very interesting what you mentioned about the lifelong learning. Is there a cutoff point at which employees no longer have access to those facilities, paying the tuition, helping with the fees?
No, in fact, it's interesting as you think about the workforce of today, the dynamics. Our workforce is aging, but the jobs continue to change. So even if you're 50 years old or 55 or 60 years old, somebody putting together a jet engine 20 years ago needs a very different skill set than somebody assembling a jet engine today. The average worker in our Middletown, Connecticut facility where we assemble jet engines is about 56. We encourage the people on the shop floor just like we encourage the people in the back office. You gotta continue to increase your skills. You have to prepare yourself for the next generation, because as we all know, look, artificial intelligence is coming, right? The way we work is going to change. So I started in public accounting 35 years ago. Today, my son is in public accounting with Price Waterhouse in Boston. And the way he does his job, very different from the way we did our jobs, right? We don't carry around big satchels anymore with all these columns of work papers. Everything's done on a computer. And he does the work of perhaps 3 or 4 of what we used to do 20 or 30 years ago. So productivity is going to continue to advance. Jobs are going to go away.
You were just mentioning while we're talking in here, the way you do business in Asia. Describe briefly for people here, what is it like to have plants and manufacturing facilities in Asia today versus vis-a-vis what you had when you first went there? How has it evolved?
So interestingly, we've been in China since shortly after the Tiananmen Square 20-some years ago. We came back Otis Elevator, in fact, installed the first elevator in Shanghai back in the 1890s, so we have a long history in China. Today, it's our biggest manufacturing facility in the world in China. And frankly, we went to China because it was a very inexpensive place to do manufacturing. It also happens to be the world's #1 elevator market. This year, about 525,000 elevators will be installed in China, about 7,000 in the US, just to give you a point of reference. The difference, of course, is when we came in 20 years ago, we had a lot of people on the shop floor building elevators. I was there perhaps 3 or 4 years ago in our facility in Tianjin, China, and we had about 1,500 people on the shop floor building elevators. I was back this past March. I took the same tour, a new facility, and now we had 900 people doing the same number of elevators and 300 robots. Now imagine robots in China. And as I was talking to the local leader, Perry Zhang, I said, Perry, how can you possibly justify this? I mean, you know, labor is cheap, and labor's not cheap, right? I mean, the cost of a worker in China is not much different than a cost of a worker in middle America. And productivity out of robots, as you can imagine, is a lot better. They don't go on strike, they don't call in sick, and they work 24/7 without complaining. But more than that, we were forced to do that because everybody is starting to understand that productivity in China is now going to come through automation. So we need to stay ahead of the competition. Everybody is doing this, but what it means is China, just like the US, is going to have to find a place for displaced workers. And so we avail ourselves, our employees do, to our employee scholar program in China. But it's a very different workforce there. So they will have the same challenges that we have here in the States, and I think it'll come on even faster because inflation is high in China, labor costs are going up. We used to go to China for low cost, now we go to Malaysia, now we go to Vietnam, we go to Indonesia. But labor arbitrage, it's a temporary phenomenon. It's transitory. Right? Eventually, technology will eliminate most of these jobs.
Expand a little bit, Greg, on a concept that is discussed often, public-private partnerships. And since you're a very global company, how do you see those vary across, for example, doing business in the US? What is the difference between those partnerships in the US, Latin America, Asia, Europe? How do they vary? How do you see the reactions or the policies from governments and the differences in those places?
So let me just take that from a couple of different angles. One is, I think in this country we need to start celebrating the fact that not everybody needs a 4-year college degree. And I think we need to have people focused on skills that are really necessary to be successful in life and to have a job when you're done with your education. And so that means trade schools, that means community colleges. The fact is, I'm going to be hiring 25,000 people in the US in the next 3 years. I can't find those people today because they don't have the skills I need to assemble jet engines, to install elevators, to make air conditioners. And so we're taking it upon ourselves to train them. I think we have a great opportunity with the community college system here in this country to redirect those resources, to retrain folks in some of the skill sets that maybe not be as glamorous as being an accountant, which, okay, it's great, or an engineer. Right? But the fact is, we need people to know how to use their hands to do mechanical things. We'll need carpenters, we need healthcare workers, we need all those things. It's a great story here in the US, in Rhode Island, which is I think the smallest state in the country. I had lunch with the governor a week and a half ago, Governor Raimondo, and she has been working with the local community colleges to dedicate them to the skills needed by the employers in the area. And so Electric Boat, which makes submarines down in Groton, Connecticut, and in Rhode Island, needs 5,000 welders. Right? Now, welding doesn't seem like a great profession, but you can make yourself $100,000, $150,000 a year in the shipyard if you know how to weld. She actually established a community college to produce welders. Every year, they're going to have 500 welders coming out of this community college because that's how she keeps the business in the state. Those are the types of public-private partnerships that we need to foster. If you think about Germany in contrast, about 60% of the kids coming out of high school in Germany go to a trade or apprenticeship program. If you look at the 15 to 24-year-old population in Germany, the unemployment rate's about 6.7%. If you look at the rest of the EU, which doesn't have a similar program, it's almost 18%, so 3 times as high. It works. But we need to take the opportunity to jointly work between the universities, the community colleges, local governments, and businesses to, first of all, identify the skills, come up with a program, and then figure out how to fund it jointly. At the end of the day, those people coming out of those community colleges and apprenticeship programs, they have great paying jobs, they pay taxes, they help the community, they make the community stronger, the country stronger. And I think what's happened in Germany, we need more of here. I think, as we think about that around the world, it's really a model, what Germany has done and what's trying to be replicated here. I have not seen that in many other countries, though.
Interesting. Let me switch topics a little bit and talk about something that we see with a bit of envy in the developing world, energy, and the dramatic transformation that is taking place in the U.S. In the developing world and Latin America. The lore and the myth had it that the U.S. was a blood-sucking vampire that would take our oil, our gold, our silver, and what have you.
Iron ore.
Las venas abiertas, the open veins of Latin America, we had that. But now, lo and behold, the blood-sucking vampire is exporting blood now. The U.S. is getting to the point of energy self-sufficiency. They can export energy, and the cheapest energy in the planet is now inside the biggest economy in the planet. To light up this room here with Henry Hub price gas would cost a quarter of what it costs to light it up in Brazil with Bolivian gas or in Europe with Russian gas. Right. How does that going to affect corporate decisions, particularly in labor-intensive sectors or sectors that can arbitrage that low-cost energy for manufacturing?
It's interesting. Energy costs have always been the key, I think, to manufacturing success. And this country has been blessed by, again, this great energy resources that fracking has unleashed. Last year, energy consumption in the country actually went down because of sustainability and green initiatives. But the fact is, the U.S. is a net exporter of energy today, something they haven't done historically. And I think it's changing the geopolitics of oil, where the Middle East had been so important for so many years to U.S. national security interests. All of a sudden, you can take a little different view of what's going on in the Middle East. But at the same time, you have to think about what it does to the economy here in the U.S. We have to keep in mind that greenhouse gases is still a pollutant. We have to think about how we have cleaner energy. Even if it's cheaper, there are other costs associated with it that we have to think about from a sustainability standpoint. So, look, it's great for business here in the U.S. So when we think about where we install facilities, I know it's important to have low energy costs. I'm actually on the board at Nucor Steel, which is the largest steel producer in the United States. And the number one input cost after, of course, scrap steel and iron ore is electricity for their electric arc furnaces. The fact is they can make energy cheaper today than they could make it 10 years, or they could make steel cheaper today than 10 years ago because energy has come down so much. Wow. And so it gives the U.S. a huge competitive advantage in some basic industries. Now, we still need iron ore, we still need copper, we still need other natural resources from around the world, but being energy independent really changes the dynamic of industry, as well as, I think, our national political outlook globally.
Greg, how do you deal with, as a company, with the uncertainty that has been brought about by existing trade arrangements being questioned and changed worldwide? I mean, for a while it looked like Trans-Pacific was a reality, Transatlantic was a reality. In South America, I was somewhat concerned that there was going to be this integration of the U.S. towards Europe, the U.S. towards Asia, and we were going to be left dangling. Now it looks like they're not coming to pass. In Latin America, of course, there's a lot of discussion on if the NAFTA trade agreement gets changed. That one has been copy-pasted for Central America, Colombia, Chile, Peru, all those countries. So it would reverberate down to the entire region. So as a company, how do you deal in times where things that look to be certain trade arrangements can be changed, or things that look like they were going to happen, Trans-Pacific, Transatlantic, look like they may not?
It's interesting, Mr. President. I think that, if you think back about the U.S. historically, this country was founded on two guiding principles. That is immigration, the ability to attract workers from around the world to provide a better life. And on top of that, with globalization came free trade. And I think if we turn our backs on both of those things, we are missing a huge opportunity. Again, I think the attacks on globalization and free trade are misguided. If you look in the US from 2000 to 2010, we saw the largest net loss of manufacturing jobs in this country. And people said, well, that's globalization, right? That's jobs being exported to Mexico. That's jobs being exported to Asia, to China. And the fact is, when you break down the statistics, 88% of the job losses was due to productivity and automation. Only about 10% was actually due to the effects I would call globalization or free trade. If we shut our borders, if we cut off the investment, if we cut off the intellectual transfer, or the transfer of intellectual property from people coming into this country, we miss a huge opportunity to capitalize on those things going forward. So, look, I have been a very strong advocate. We have disagreements with the administration on free trade. You know, is the NAFTA treaty perfect? Well, of course not. It's a treaty. It's a compromise, like all things. And so are there ways to do it better? Perhaps. But I think tearing up and eliminating the basic framework of NAFTA would be wrong. This has created a lot of wealth in Mexico. It's helped jobs in Canada. It's also created jobs in the US, exporting our grains, exporting other things to Mexico. This is not a one-way street where jobs are just migrating out of the country. Obviously, it costs less to do business in Mexico from a direct labor standpoint. But frankly, we can't find workers to do many of those jobs that are at the lower end of the wage scale anyways. We'd rather have those people doing jobs that create intellectual property, adding to the economy, adding to the wealth of this country.
On something a little closer to where I come from, Latin America's headlines are dominated to a large degree by the corruption scandal from Brazil, Lava Jato, and being that if something happens in Bolivia or Nicaragua, it kind of stays there, but if it happens in Brazil, it reverberated across Dominican Republic, Colombia, Mexico, everywhere, and which is very good in a sense that there is a judicial system in Brazil that is addressing corruption. But I imagine that has a slowdown effect or affects negatively the infrastructure investment or the business investment climate. Are you feeling the effects of this massive Brazil corruption investigation in the business side inside of Latin America?
Yeah, I think any company like ours who has large operations in Brazil has been impacted by the corruption scandal because of the uncertainty. I should point out, though, that corruption is not endemic to just Latin America. We see it in China, we see it in India, we see it in Western Europe, we see it in the US. The fact is, rooting out this corruption, it's like a tax on the system. And if you can eliminate that tax, everybody does better. So I applaud the efforts to root out corruption at all levels, and it's not easy, but it's absolutely imperative to give everybody a level playing field. But it happens here, it happens there. I think that the problem in Brazil has been particularly acute because it's happened at the highest levels of government, where you see a president being impeached, you see her successor now under pressure for various allegations. Those types of things at the high level cause people to step back and say, am I really want to make that next investment in Brazil, or should we wait to see what happens? And so right now, many multinationals, United Technologies included, we've taken a pause on investment in Brazil. And that's unfortunate because I think it's a great country, it's got great demographics, great natural resources, a lot of opportunity for growth. But right now, until we have some certainty around the political outlook, it's hard to make investments. I mean, say what you will about China. There is stability in the government, right? Why has China been so successful? Infrastructure and a stable government. Now, we can argue about the form of government might not be conducive to free expression, but in terms of political stability, it's been wonderful. And I think that's why you've seen such great growth there and why you continue to see investment there is because we're not worried about who's going to be in charge next year.
Yeah. Let me ask you on, I take it that the Chinese stability is an environment that allows you to do long-term planning in business. I think you hinted at it, but I guess I'd like to expand on that idea. If you had to pick a model of young people's training from a state policy, from a public sector standpoint, for business, which model would that be, and how can you replicate and clone that system that I think you hinted at the German model?
Yeah, I think, again, that the German model is easy to understand because it doesn't create two classes of citizen. It just simply creates two paths to educate your workforce. And so 60% of the kids coming out of high school, they become apprentices or they go into trades, and they are taught a different skill set than the 40% that go on to university. Now, that's a tough sell in this country. I think it's a tough sell around the world to say, hey, you can't be an engineer, you need to be a mechanic in an aircraft engine assembly plant. Well, the fact is people have different skills, and the more that we can help people early on to identify what they're good at, what their basic skill sets are, and where they can have a long career. I mean, the fact is, who wants to work on an auto assembly line if you know that job is going to go away in 10 years? And so I think, you have to not just train people for today, you have to give them the opportunity to learn skills and to improve those skills over time, every single year, because things will change rapidly. And if we don't address that, I think people will say, look, let me get a college degree because I can always do something. But it has to be much more broad, and I think, again, the Germans have the right answer.
Well, thank you, Greg. I could keep it going, but this is like democracy and politics. When your time's up, you got to go home unless you're in Venezuela. But now our time is up. Thank you. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you.